Welcome to week 9 of Geography and Tourism Studies 2P21. This is Jeff Boggs. Last week, we discussed how to design and deliver survey questionnaires. That is, if you are a human geographer or a tourism studies student, there's a good chance that that is how you will collect your data when you go to Peterborough, if past experience is anything to go on. This week, we will learn the basics of designing interview guides and how to conduct a couple of different kinds of interviews. Spickard's 6 steps you will recall because this is the 9th week that I've gone through this slide. The first step is develop a good research question. Remember, good means that it is clear, it is focused, and it is specific.
We then choose a corresponding logical structure. Spickard names 10 of these. Then he suggests that you decide upon or you identify the type of data that you need to answer that research question.
In the logical structure that you picked. And he goes on to enumerate 14 of those puppies. Fourth point, step 4, pick a data collection method. So figure out how you are going to get that data. He identifies 12 techniques, though we probably could come up with even more, but we'll stick with his 12. Then, and this is where his sort of a list of, 10 or 14 or 12 is not reproduced. He then says, choose your site and your sampling strategy. So your site is the place that you're interested in, and you're interested in it because it has the things that you need to measure or interview or survey or somehow, count or otherwise interact with to make sense of, to collect data to answer your research question. And then you want to pick a sampling strategy. So you might decide, is this a random sample? Is it a non-random sample? If it's either random or non-random, what then is the population that you're interested in? If it's random, what would your sampling frame be? If it's non-random, what are the characteristics of whatever it is that you want to collect data on? And those should then be found back in your site. And then the 6th step is pick a data analysis method. And here also, he does not provide us a list. Instead, he provides us basically, I think, chapters 7 to 13 that go on to describe different research projects that have been conducted. And as he does that, he identifies not just the data analysis methods, but also, all of these previous 5 steps as well. In this lecture, we focus on interviews and sort of preparing for interviews, but also creating interview guides. So interview guides are the instruments I think of these as sheets of paper that contain your interview questions on them. And if those questions are supposed to be asked in a particular order, then it contains that particular order as well. Spickard provides us concrete examples of how to design and use interview guides. And he does this really in chapter 9, where he provides examples of reports of using interview guides to collect reports of acts, behaviors, and events, to collect data on self-identity, to collect data on deeply held opinions and attitudes, on personal feelings, on cultural knowledge, and on expert knowledge. So if you are planning on using an interview guide as a way to collect data, if that's what you're going to describe in your research proposal, you will want to take a second look at chapter 9, just to make sure you have all of these bits and bobs sort of assimilated. Oh, right, and then the appendices, so the very back of the book, pages 363 to 369, he has some charts, and so he has some flow charts and some examples that might be useful as well. Let's talk about the difference between an interview guide and an interview. So when people talk about interviews, they're usually talking about the procedure used to collect data by asking people questions. And by asking them questions that are usually answered with sort of a open-ended, well, I guess these are open-ended questions that are usually asked. And we expect the responses to be longer than yes or no. Sometimes you can ask somebody a question and it'll take them 10 or 15 minutes to provide their answer. So the interview, we can think of that as the procedure. The interview guide is the instrument that we use to collect the data. So the interview guide contains the questions. It might also contain prompts. So prompts are things that you might say to get people to go on further if they're sort of stuck. And it can include some additional information that you might want to read verbatim to the person that you're interviewing, especially information about research ethics approval and informed consent. Sometimes the interview guide gets called an interview protocol. It just depends upon which source you read. So interview protocol is another name for an interview guide. So there are three common features to interviews. The first being that they usually produce qualitative data. So they do not usually produce quantitative data. The data takes one or more forms. These might be notes that you write down as you are having an interview with someone. So in these notes, you're writing down their responses to your questions. There may also be audio recordings or even audio and video recordings, depending on the situation. Nowadays, with smartphones, audio and video recordings are kind of blasé. Like you're used to, as a, however young you are, 20-year-old, you're used to videotaping. I don't even call it videotaping, recording, with your smartphone or other device, both audio and visual, moving pictures, if you will, if I want to put it in a really old term. So that's what we mean by recordings. The last bit are transcripts. And so transcripts are usually word for word. If I listen to a recording, from that I can make a transcript. And so the transcript is a word for word transcription. That's where transcript comes from. So literally, you write out word for word what is said on the recording, so that you can then look at it. You can read. So you convert the words that are spoken into written words, and that makes it easier to then analyze your data. And so you might use transcripts you might feed them into some software and then code them in that software. NVivo is an expensive but common bit of software, but there's also off-the-shelf kind of open source software that does this as well. Or you might instead use a sort of an old-fashioned system where you use colored pens and underlining and things like that to come up with a coding system on your transcript. You can also code from your notes. People will do that sometimes. And so remember, your notes are not going to be word for word. That's word for word utterances. So the things that people say are only going to be captured on audio recordings and in transcripts made from the audio recordings. A thing that you can do with video recordings is that you could actually also code how people, their physical performance, if you will, the way they hold their body, the way they present themselves to you and the camera. You can also code that as well. Though we're not going to talk too much about that. The third common feature of interviews is that the data is almost always collected the individual unit of observation, and then you can aggregate up to either a group or a location. So most of the time when you conduct an interview, it's with one other person. There is something called focus groups, which are kind of a group interview. So that's the kind of like in that different people respond to the questions and they have conversations with each other. And in a focus group, these conversations with each other often produces insights for researchers that they might not have come up with, or they'll hear things that they might not have heard in a one-on-one interview. But most of the time, interview data tends to be collected at the individual unit of observation. So, I go interview a particular person, and then I have my questions with, that are on my interview guide, and I might take notes. I might also record either audio and video, and then usually afterwards I'm going to transcribe this. Though again, not everybody transcribes either. So, but I think that's everything for this slide. Oh, yeah. So, and I just talked about this. Focus groups are the exception to this, and we'll talk more about those in a little bit. Spickard identifies three, kinds or models of interviews, and the first is the one that I am most familiar with. These are standard interviews. And standard interviews usually take the form of you just conduct the interview once, you write up your notes, maybe if you have audio and visual recordings, then you transcribe those as well, and then once you have your transcription or just your notes, then you code those, which then leads kind of to the analysis. So what kinds of themes emerged in the responses across all of the different individual interviews that you had. But so for standard interview, you usually just interview somebody once. A variation of this is called a life history interview. Well, we're not going to go there. I don't want to do that. Okay, so we've done standard interviews. We also have something that he describes as hermeneutic interviews, and which I'd never heard of until I read this book, which leads me to believe that this is something that he has done on occasion. And so hermeneutic interviews involve first conducting an interview, then you show your notes to your interviewees to see if you understood them. This implies, or this assumes, that they can read your notes, right? But so you conduct your interview, you take notes, you maybe also have recordings and transcriptions. Oh, and if you are ever going to record anyone, you always need to get consent before you begin recording, right? So, And also, if you're going to interview anyone, you also need to get consent for that. So you can't just sort of do a drive-by interview and all of a sudden interview somebody. That, at least in academic circles, is not cool. In theory, you can get in trouble for that. Okay. So for hermeneutic interview, first conduct the interview. You show your notes to whoever you've interviewed to let them see how you've kind of processed or thought about that interview. And then they give you feedback. You revise your notes, you show it to them again, and you keep doing this until your interviewees, so for each person that you interviewed, you keep doing that until they say, okay, you understand what you have written here really reflects what I was talking about. My suspicion is that that can be a maddening process, but you do you. If you want to engage in hermeneutic interviews, go ahead. I wouldn't recommend it for the Peterborough Field course, given that you only have 3 days to collect your data. So I would go with standard interviews for that, or I would go with focus groups, which I've talked a bit about. Focus groups usually have like between 6 and 12 people. They'll take an hour or two. They're used a lot in marketing as a way to get people to talk about maybe a particular candidate, if it's kind of political marketing, or what they like about particular kinds of shoes, if it's a marketer who's employed to understand changing views on shoes and what people are looking for in shoes. And it's not usually just a sort of a widely disparate group of people. They tend to bring together people that share a couple of things in common. So they might bring together geography and tourism studies students who have been enrolled at Brock University in the last 5 years. And they might, we might even then say they still have to be enrolled in the program. So they can't be graduated. They can't be students that said, screw it, I'm going to go major in biology instead, or screw it, I'm going to drop out and go to hike the Himalayas or whatever. So your focus groups, you typically have a sample, like usually a non-random sample of people who share some things in common. Standard interviews. Let's say a bit about those. So standard interviews involves you interviewing your subject. So we don't really say respondent. A respondent is what you have with the survey. So with an interview, you tend to have interview subjects. So we interview our subject. We then transcribe the interview if we've recorded it, or we write up our notes. And writing up your notes can take a couple of different ways, I suppose. So often when I'm interviewing someone, I'll just kind of scrawl stuff down on a piece of paper or numerous pieces of paper, often pointing back to which question these notes that I'm writing correspond to. And then after the interview is done, as soon as I can after that interview is done, I go somewhere and I sit down and I write up more about that experience. I've even, in some cases, written up as I was waiting for the interview to start before I went in, to a meeting. If I was sitting in the lobby of, in these cases, I'm thinking of book publishing houses. I'm sitting in the lobby or in the waiting room, or if it's a really small book publishing house, I'm sitting in the same room with somebody who is on the phone, and they're waiting for the person I'm going to interview to be ready. And while I'm there, I might take notes as well of just about what the place looks like, because you never really know until after the fact what might be useful. So that's kind of my justification for that. Once you have collected your data, you code. So if you've transcribed your interview, or you've just written up your notes. In either case, you can still code those. So look for themes, within each interview, and then you start reading through your, let's say you had 25 interview subjects. You would read through these interview transcripts or your notes, or both if you have both. You should really have both if you're going to transcribe. And you might read through it all 25 of them the first time. And then on the second round, then you might start thinking about, okay, well, they're talking about this topic or that topic, or, they all respond to this question in sort of one of three ways. But it sounds really cheesy or dorky or silly, but you kind of sit down with your transcripts or your notes and you immerse yourself in them. And as patterns will often begin to emerge, assuming that everybody was asked sort of roughly the same set of questions. At that point, then you analyze your data, and so you might want to look at Spickard for some examples of this. The next then is hermeneutic interviews. And actually, let me stop right here. Before you can even conduct your interviews, you need to line up interviews. So that means you need to identify people that could be interviewed, or people that might be able to answer the questions that you have. And so this requires you to think about both the population and then the kind of sample that you want from that population. I believe later in the lecture we'll talk a bit more about that, but just remember that whether it's traditional or hermeneutic or focus groups interviews, that all of this presupposes that you've already identified people that you would like to interview, and then some of them have agreed to be interviewed. And even before all of that, you've also gotten Research Ethics Board clearance if you're doing this through a university, if you are sort of operating under the auspices of a university. So you've either gotten Research Ethics Board clearance, or in the case of the Peterborough course, you've gotten clearance from your course instructor who's looked over your questions to make sure you're not asking anything untoward and things like that. So all of that stuff presupposes the actual interview phase, right? And all of that can be a big pain in the neck. But we'll save some more about that later. With hermeneutic interviews, again, you interview your subject, you transcribe your interview, you also write up your notes, and from this you come up with kind of an understanding of what they were talking about in response to your questions, and then you go back to your interviewee and you show them both the transcript but also your notes to see if they want to expand on or alter anything. And so with regards to the transcript, a thing that can happen is that whoever is doing the transcription, and it's probably going to be you, so whoever's listening to the recording and then typing that out, sometimes you'll mishear things. And so one of the benefits of having your interview subject look back over the transcript is that they can say, oh no, I didn't say apple pie, I said apartheid, right? Those are very different things. So, and I just bring that up because once I was being interviewed, and I talked about in the 80s how at lots of universities there were kind of protests to get universities in the United States to divest from South Africa as a kind of a protest against apartheid in South Africa. And the person who interviewed me must not have known what apartheid was, because I can't remember what they wrote, but it was not apartheid. So the benefit then of even if it's not a full-on hermeneutic interview, The benefit of letting your interviewee look at the transcript is that they might be able to identify words or phrases that you transcribed and then got wrong. So when I was doing this, I didn't use, when I interviewed lots of people for my dissertation, usually it was in German. And so I didn't bother to do full on transcripts. Instead, I would sort of, write out the responses to the questions in a sort of combination of like German and then English. And it was a big mess. But that is, one way to go about transcriptions. So especially if you're transcribing something from a language that is not your first language, or a language that you are sort of like a native speaker in. So in those cases, I found it, I would often write out kind of what was said in German, as the best I understood it. And then sometimes I'd have to look words up, like, did they say this or did they say that? And then make sense of it in English, and sort of write a bit in English that kind of summarized their response as well. Okay. So once this stage is done, once they've said, oh, no, I meant this or I meant that, you then go back, write up your notes again, and then bring it back to them. And when they're finally at the stage where they say, okay, you get what I meant, that's cool, then at that stage, then you can start to code your data. And so the argument here is that you're trying to capture to the best of your ability, and to the, bearing in mind the limits of spoken language, and spoken language that is then transcribed into written language, you're trying to capture what your interview subject meant. So then you code your data, and then after you have coded your data, then you analyze it, usually by looking for commonalities across subjects, or by subjects I mean people, or similarities, differences. Also, you might consider, okay, what does the literature say about this particular topic? Are the people that I'm interviewing, are they also saying things that are consistent with what's in the literature, or are they saying something new? So that's, in a nutshell, hermeneutic interviews. Here we have a diagram of the hermeneutic circle, in which at the top we start with our interview subject. They provide us with words that are then, you are the interviewer here at the bottom. So you hear these words, you record these words, you interpret these words, because hermeneutics is about interpretation. And then you provide your interpretation to the interview subject. They again then provide you, more words, either written or spoken form, about your interpretation of what they said. And this goes around until hopefully it eventually stops, right? So, and once it's stopped, once your interview subject thinks that you understand what they meant, at that point, you can then start to code that data. And you don't do this with just one interview subject, you do it with all of them. So with hermeneutic interviews, you tend to have a smaller number of interviews, and what tends to happen is that in the process of engaging in what's called the hermeneutic circle, of this sort of going around the mulberry bush, as it were, with the subject and the interviewer, with the interview trying to understand the subject, is that you end up having lots of extra conversations and communications, which you're probably also taking notes on, but not transcribing. So, because that would just make it even crazier. All right, so that's the hermeneutic circle. Focus group interviews. For those, you assemble a group of people that are similar. So maybe similar in age or an ethnic or racial composition or education level, or they all, are from the same part of town, but they share some things in common, right? Maybe they're all volunteers, but maybe for different kinds of organizations. So you assemble this group, you ask them your questions, and as you're doing that, what will often happen is, one person will begin to speak and then someone else will speak. And through this sort of crosstalk, as a researcher, you'll hear new things. But one of the problems that can happen is that sometimes you'll have people who, I like to call them conversation hogs. Professors are very bad at being conversation hogs. I am one myself. Conversation hogs, the way that you deal with those, actually in a classroom, but also in focus groups, is you can just ask for, if you say like, you're talking too much, that shuts people down. You don't want to do that. You want to say, oh, well, can we hear from some new voices? Can we hear from people who haven't spoken yet? Do you agree with, that response, or, do you have a different take on this? And the hope is that by getting people to have a conversation that answers, each of your questions, you'll gain insights that you would not otherwise gain from one-on-one interviews. You then transcribe the interview or, write up your notes. And sometimes with focus groups, people, and I think actually I've never run a focus group. I think Chris Fullerton has a couple of times. Like in a planning context, this is common to get feedback from people in the community. But one way that you deal with the cacophony, with the multitude of people that are talking and providing information, is that you might set up multiple audio, so multiple microphones and maybe a couple of cameras as well, so that you can see who's speaking when, and by having a couple of different microphones, that allows you to better capture everyone who's speaking. But also with the cameras, then you can pay attention to body language, which might be useful in understanding, conflict in the group or around a particular topic. Or it might reveal, what questions make some people more or less comfortable based on how they sort of hold their body. You then code your transcripts or your notes, and then you analyze your data as well.
So we've just talked about the 3 different kinds of interviews, the 3 interview styles, I think is how Spickard refers to it. And what I want to turn to now are best practices in designing interview guides. So remember, the interview guide contains all of your questions. So let's turn to that. So here we're thinking about designing the guide. Later on in this lecture, we'll talk more specifically about designing particular questions. So this is sort of what you need to do before you design particular specific questions, right? So the first thing is you want to not ask your interviewees your central research question. That will just confuse them. And it's often because your central research question will need to be unpacked. And so to you, it's clear as a single question, but to actually then answer that question, you'll have to ask a lot of other questions. And there's a way to figure out what questions you need to ask in your interview guide to get at your central research question that involves sort of 3 steps. what I like about Spickard is he's into steps and sort of making things methodical. So we have to translate our central research question, our main research question. This is the research question in your research proposal. We have to translate it into more specific interview questions. And Spickard provides a sort of a three-stage procedure for doing this. So you'll see here, I talk about CRQ, TQs, and IQs. So a CRQ is a central research question. That's what Spickard calls it. That's equivalent to your research question in your research proposal. Then he has TQs, and you'll notice that it's plural. It's got an S on it. Those are theoretical questions that emerge out of your lit review. And after that, then there are IQs, again with an S. These are interview questions. So these interview questions are sort of derived from the theoretical questions, and the theoretical questions emerge from the lit review that you used to sort of provide the background information to identify what other people have written about when you were what other people have written about when they were exploring either your research question or one somewhat similar to it. With that in mind, let's talk about each of these three stages. So the first stage is the central research question. You actually already have experience with this. You've already been working for some weeks now on developing your research question. So first, as you were writing your annotated bibliography, and then as you were writing your literature review, and it's possible that your research question, has changed over time and has probably become more focused. So the central research question is the research question identified in your research proposal. So that's what you're writing for the end of the semester. To come up with an example for this that's sort of easy for me to sort of riff off the top of my head is, I'm coming up with a question here that's been one that I've been interested over the years, but haven't been able to do much work on directly. But it's my research question is, how does one's geographical trajectory shape their occupational trajectory? Which is a bit highfalutin, a bit maybe more sophisticated than it really needs to be. Another way that I might rephrase this is basically, how does where you are shape what you do for a living? Or, how does where one lives shape what one does for a living? Or how does where one has lived and currently lives shape, what they do for a living?
Let me apologize for the sound quality on the previous two slides. While working on this, I was almost done with this damnable lecture, and then basically when I move my computer, if it's not on my laptop, if it's not on a really solid surface, it sort of restarts the machine, and I moved it when I only had 2 slides left to finish, and it didn't save basically everything from the previous 2 slides to everything up to before the last 2 slides. So I'm sort of refinishing this in a rush. Anyway, sorry about that. Hopefully the sound quality is better now. So Spickard's second stage in designing an interview guide or an interview protocol, some people might call it, is to develop theory-based questions. So Q here stands for questions. And you'll notice that there's an S on there to imply that it's not just one question. So your research proposal, and especially in 2P21, your research proposal should really just have one research question, because that helps you stay focused. It keeps you from getting more complicated than you need to be for the purposes of the assignment. It allows you to kind of really hone in on developing your skills to answer one research question. With that in mind, when he's talking about theory-based questions, these are questions that probably, in your lit review probably won't come up. If you were going to write a much longer literature review with, more than 8 or 9 sources in it, then it's likely that you might actually organize your lit review around sort of common questions in the literature. But don't do that for 2P21. So the next goal for you is to really write a research proposal that is doable. Okay, so theory-based questions. These are drawn from your lit review, and they're used to develop interview questions. So they're kind of like a middle ground between your research question and the actual questions you ask people that you will be interviewing. And these are questions that often emerge out of your lit review, so that people studying whatever it was you were interested in might tend to ask these other kinds of questions. And that when they ask those questions, they'll often develop theories. So theories are kind of often thought of as kind of internally consistent sets of explanations. A colleague of mine would refer to theories as an interlocking web of, I think, nomothetic claims or something to that effect, right? Which is so much cooler coming from him because he has this cool Romanian accent, but that's a different thing. Okay, so a theoretical or a theory-based question relating back to my research question, my core research question, my central research question might be, how does living in a specialized industrial district influence the kinds of jobs available? And in economic geography, industrial districts are places, they're locations that are specialized to such a degree that they are often sort of world famous, or at least, famous or important within a particular country or part of the planet. And an example in the Canadian case might be, Hamilton might have at one time had an industrial district when it came to steel manufacturing. I think nowadays Hamilton mainly just has 2 big steel companies and some like Dofasco, and I can never remember the name of the other one. But these companies then have probably, grown or evolved over the years in such a way that they have specialized parts suppliers that might, or specialized repair services that are located also in Hamilton. And if you need your kiln rebricked, for instance, then there may well be a firm that specializes in rebricking kilns. Or if you need your safety equipment cleaned or inspected, there may well be a specialized company that does that. So the idea of an industrial district is that it's historically it's thought of as a really kind of geographically compact, sort of tightly clustered together a bunch of firms and actually residences for workers that work in that industry that those firms provide goods or services for. I suppose, we might think of like the financial district in Toronto as a sort of maybe an industrial district, in the sense that, that finance is an industry. They don't make things, or unless you consider junk bonds and derivatives to be things, but they provide specialized financial services. And so, it might be that, how does living in a specialized industrial district influence the kinds of jobs available? Might be that if you grow up in the Toronto financial district, that maybe you're more likely to find out about all the possible kinds of jobs in finance, or you're more likely to find that out than if you lived, outside of an industrial district and weren't exposed to that industry. Likewise, if you grew up in Hamilton, and especially in communities where you have, like kind of multiple generations that have worked in the steel industry, it might well be that in those contexts, you become more aware of the kinds of jobs and opportunities that exist in the steel industry than somebody who grew up, say, in, I don't know, Niagara Falls or Barrie. Industrial districts, I suppose another way, other examples of industrial districts might be, the Hollywood Entertainment Complex in Southern California, so largely located in Los Angeles County, kind of, in a couple of different, numerous different cities. Los Angeles County has, last time I counted, like 70 or 80 municipalities, because it's the United States and it's kind of crazy like that. But you might also then think of, the London Financial District as a kind of industrial district as well. So a really famous industrial district in the literature is, fiddlesticks, I can't remember the name of the place now. But in the United Kingdom, there was a paper written in the early 50s, I believe, it was the Birmingham Gun District. So this was a part of the city of Birmingham that had specialized in, for a couple of centuries, in producing firearms that were then supplied to the British government, so, and other users as well. So I need to write that down. If I have to teach 2P01, or sorry, 2P03, that might actually be a good reading to use. Okay, Birmingham Industrial District. All right, so the point here is that this question either was directly asked in the literature that I would have reviewed, or it sort of emerges out of that because, I might have read literature. I have read lots of literature over the years, over the decades on industrial districts. And I've read, a fair amount in literature on the geography of labor markets. And bringing those together leads me to wonder, to what degree does living in an industrial district influence the kinds of jobs that are available, but also, and by available, I mean, this could also include, usable as examples or inspiration for people as they're growing up. So that it sort of helps them think about, like, oh, I'd like to do that, right? Whereas if you've never heard about a particular occupation or a kind of job, then it might never occur to you that somebody could do that for a living. The point to remember, and Spickard talks about this in chapter 9, is that a central research question will have many theoretical questions that are associated with it. Or that once you explore your central research question in the literature, you're likely to have identified numerous theoretical questions that will then inform how you answer your central research question. And here is his figure 9.3 that look here, he cited. So he actually got it from Tom Wengraf in Qualitative Research Interviewing, written in 2001 by Sage. Sage is also the company that published his book. But here's a source. So he's saying, like, here's this figure that I'm using, but actually this dude, Tom Wengraf, made it. So that's very good of him to do that because he's not engaged in academic misconduct. So this is, though, why your literature review is important, is that it helps you think about answers to your central research question. Spickard then goes on to talk about interview questions as his kind of third stage. And so these are questions that you will actually ask your interviewees. For instance, if I were going to stick with my central research question and, even my theoretical research question that I came up with, which I may or may not actually have in my proposal, like in your proposal, I wouldn't expect to see that. If it were for a graduate student or, for publication in a peer-reviewed journal or a book, it'd be more likely to kind of flesh those out. But in your case, you want to think of those as kind of intermediary steps that lead you to your interview questions, but you don't necessarily need to spell those theoretical questions out, given the limitations of your paper. It's only, I think, going to be somewhere between, 8 and 10 pages long. So your proposal, it's not a paper, sorry. So a question I might ask an interview subject is, where did you live in 1997? That would let me know, where did they live back then? And also, if they tell me where they live, I might know whether or not there are industrial districts there, right? So do they live in a place that is specialized in an activity that isn't found in many other places? Second question, what led you to live there? So this is helping me kind of set up, the first question helps me kind of set up the time in my interview subject's mind. So it gets them to think back to what were they doing 23 years ago. And then, the second question, what led you to live there? You'll notice, this is a really open-ended question. So it might be, oh, well, I was born there, or my parents moved there when I was 7, or, my parents got a divorce and I moved with my mom to this place because that's where her parents lived. And, my grandparents helped raise me. Something like that, right? It might be I moved there because, I was following my boyfriend, or, I moved there because, I volunteered in a nonprofit and they had a paid opening in this city. And so that's why I moved there. Or, I moved there, I lived there because I initially went to college there, or I initially went to university there, right? So there can be all kinds of reasons that led people to live in that place in 1997, wherever that place is. And then I ask, what job did you have then? So when, in 1997, when they got there, what kind of job did they have? And then in question 4 here, did you have that job before you lived there? And so actually, this is a bit ambiguous now that I think about it. So it could be, did you have that job before you lived there? I could replace this with, did you have that kind of job before you lived there? But in this case, what I'm getting at is, did you have that job before you lived there? Basically, did you get transferred by a company? So you worked for a company, maybe you were an accountant or an electrician or whatever. And the company said, oh, we either, we're closing down the location here, we need you to move there, to this other place, or, there's an opening for your job in this other location. So that's how that question is intended to be read, or intended, the kind of information that is intended to get at. So that illustrates this point that one theoretical question then will have many interview questions. And in Spickard's book, in figure 9.4, he has this diagram. So remember, you've got your central research question. That's the research question in your proposal. You've got these theoretical research questions that may or may not end up in your proposal. In a longer one, they should be there, but in yours, that's not necessarily the case. And it's possible that these are sort of related to your themes in your lit review. And then once you've kind of figured out the theoretical questions, then that helps you figure out your interview questions. And so what happens is you'll have one or more interview question that corresponds to each theoretical question. So if one of my questions has to do with, if one of my theoretical questions is about how industrial districts influence the kinds of jobs people end up taking, or the kinds of careers they end up having, if living in an industrial district shapes your occupational trajectory, so the kinds of jobs that you'll have over the course of your life, then it might be that I've got a couple of different questions that I ask my interview subject that help get at that. So one might be, where did you live? And then I'll know, it's likely that I might know, okay, that there is an industrial district there. And they then might say, one of their responses of, why they were there. So the second interview question might be like, oh, I grew up there. My family moved there originally from Italy in the, 1920s. And, we always just stayed there because we found, work in the metals and in the steel industry, right? That right there suggests to me like, oh, here's somebody who grew up in a place where their family worked in this particular industry. So it doesn't mean that it's necessarily an industrial district at that point, but it suggests that that could be the case, right? And then if they tell me like, oh, well, the job I had before I moved there was, out in Alberta welding pipelines, but when I came back here, I just used that in my family connections to get a job back in the metals industry. So that then would sort of provide more information about, how growing up in an industrial district and having family that work in the industry associated with that industrial district, affects not only one's own occupational trajectory, but actually, remember my core research question is about kind of the relation between your geographical trajectory and your occupational trajectory. So how does where you live affect where you work, or vice versa? That then provides some fodder to answer that question as well. And what is really helpful about this three-tiered system of a central research question, multiple theoretical questions, and then each theoretical question being related to one or more interview questions, is that this structure actually works for all kinds of research designs. So it certainly works for survey research design, but it actually works, I think, for all kinds of research. So if you're, say, a physical geographer and you're interested in, the characteristics of soil along a highway, and so does soil along highways tend to have higher levels of lead than locations further away from the highway? And this, you're all probably too young to remember this, but when I was a kid, at least in the United States, they still put lead in the gas. And the reason you put lead in gasoline is that it prevents the engine from knocking. And I believe, though don't quote me on this, that it actually helps lubricate something or another in the combustion process. The details are not clear to me. But it also meant that when cars burnt gasoline and it came out the exhaust pipe, those exhaust fumes had lead. Lead is bad in the environment in high levels, and it doesn't take a lot to be in high levels, because it in young children can cause mental retardation or intellectual disabilities, or whatever the proper term is nowadays. It also can, in addition to affecting your intellectual development, can also, kind of, I believe, stunt your growth, and there's a couple of other generally bad things that happen to you. So, and once upon a time, I know I'm digressing, but once upon a time, lead was in lots of different things, like paint, for instance. And so when I was a child, this was in the 70s, there were public service announcements on the television. This was in the United States, but I suspect Canada might have been similar, in which, the public service announcement talked about making sure that, there were no kind of chips of paint that children could eat, because often what happened with lead paint is that the places that first, realized like, holy cow, lead paint is bad for us, because not so much that you're going to inhale it, but because, as the paint flakes with age, chips will fall off. And when that happens, some people who are less than 5 years old and are really curious will put lots of things in their mouth, including lead paint, or chips of paint, and kind of chew on it or suck on it, right? Nowadays, maybe your parents were super protective, because that seems to be more common nowadays, and prevented you from putting all sorts of random things in your mouth. But even my kid, who we generally tried to keep her from putting what we thought of as bad things in her mouth, would still suck on her toes or whatever, which is kind of funny looking, to see a little baby sucking on their toes. But I remember seeing pictures from my parents of me sitting out in the yard at a house they lived at in Indianapolis, and I was munching away on leaves, and they thought it was awful cute, so they took a picture of it, right? So the thing with lead paint is that the places that were slowest to replace it were often rental properties in sort of poorer areas of town, in which landlords were not particularly interested in maintaining the sort of buildings that they had. And in those cases, you're most likely to find old paint that chips. And in those cases, you have children who are already in a disadvantaged environment, who are then ingesting lead, and as a result of that, affecting their mental development. So, which generally is a bad thing, right? How in the world did I get there? Oh, right. Okay. So I was talking about, let's imagine that you're a physical geographer and you're interested in soils and lead levels in soils. So I was talking about why lead is bad, or in a lot of cases it can be bad. It might be that you take soil samples, along a road so you basically take a transect line. So you measure with a 100-meter long tape out 100 meters, and every 5 meters, so right at the side of the road where there's soil, you take a soil sample, and then every 5 meters out for 100 meters, so along that transect, you take 20 samples, you record the location, and then it might be that so the central research question there might be, to what degree does lead pollution from vehicle emissions decline? So to what degree does levels of lead pollution from vehicle emissions decline as you move away from a road? And so it might be that your theories, like your lit review, might suggest that in some cases, people have found that it's kind of a straight line decline. So that in general, the further away you are from the side of the road, the lower the lead levels will be. But it might also be that some other authors have found that lead levels, might be really high next to the road, but because these exhaust fumes are actually rising, they're warm, right? That as they move off to the side of the road, they cool and then they drop down. And so maybe at a middle distance away from the road, like 20 or 30 meters away, maybe actually lead levels would be higher there. And so it wouldn't just be that, there's a straight line distance decay function, which just means that as you move away from the origin, so from the road, the lead levels would drop. It might be that actually as you move away, they actually increase and then they drop off again, right? And so those might be two theoretical questions related to lead levels in the soil. And you're not going to interview the soil. It's an inanimate object, but you're still going to ask questions of the soil. And so for that, instead of having an interview guide, you would have a data collection sheet. So where you record, where you found, you might even map out where you found each sample. So you know how far it was from the road and where it was. And you're probably going to have multiple transects. So let's say you had 10 transects, each with 20 observations. And so then you would have 200 observations altogether, right? Because you've got 10 times 20. And so for each soil sample that you take, you might measure the level of lead, you might measure the level of sort of background sort of life. So, microorganisms that live in the soil. Maybe you would also be interested in controlling for, what type of soil is it? Is it mostly sandy? Is it mostly clay? And then you might also be interested in soil pH and maybe a couple of other measurements as well. And so while you're not interviewing the soil, you're still, from those samples, you're still collecting information that you could actually then put into a data sheet, so a way to kind of record it. Nowadays, you'd largely put it into a spreadsheet once you ran your test on each of the soil samples. But that, collecting that data and getting those measurements, so collecting those soil samples and then, getting these different measurements from them, where you send the soil off to a lab to have these measurements made, or maybe you do it yourself. Depends on circumstances. Those are kind of like interview questions. So it's not an exact analogy, but it's a close analogy, right? And so this 3-tiered system works, whether you're going to use interviews, whether you're just using detached observation, which is what most physical geography work is going to be, or, even if you're just looking at archival records, you still will have, a main research question, a core research question. You'll have consulted some literature that will have given you some theoretical questions, and then that will help you think about creating your equivalent of interview questions, even if you're not conducting interviews. And this also works actually for quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods research. So if you're a physical geographer and you're sitting through this and you're like, why in the fiddlesticks, in the farming fiddlesticks, if we want to substitute F words in there, am I learning about interviews? So it might be, as a physical geographer, that, if you get a job with an environmental consulting firm, that sometimes you will have to interview people, but also you are going to have to collect data, and you want to think about how it relates back to your main research question, your theoretical research question, and then how you, the fancy term is operationalize, your research question and your theoretical questions into, particular things that you can measure. So this is how it's useful, even if you're a physical geographer that hates to talk to people. Let's now turn our attention to the best practice in administering interviews. So the previous bit was thinking about how you're going to construct an interview guide. And now let's talk about administering interviews. So actually selecting people to be interviewed and then eventually actually interviewing them. So the first thing we need to talk about is sampling. So if for some reason you want to use random sampling, you need a sampling frame. So a sampling frame, remember, could be something like, membership lists for an organization, or there's something called random digit dialing that is used by telephone survey companies. And it essentially, if the geography of the site, if you will, of the area that you want your survey administered, is covered by, there's 4 area codes that cover that. The survey company will, identify those area codes, and then also any 3-digit telephone prefixes that accompany those area codes that are found in that area. And so often, those first 6 digits are kind of limited. So, it might be like 905, 241, or actually, I think 289, 241 go together. But it doesn't go from 289 all the way to 001 to 999. There's a limited number of 3-digit codes that actually happen in the 289 area code. But for the 4 digits at the very end of the phone number, those are often very likely to all be used or moving in and out of service, right? And so what they'll do is generate random telephone numbers in which they constrain the area code and then the 3-digit telephone prefix to ones that actually occur in the place where they want to collect the data. And then those will still be selected randomly from a limited pool, but then the 4 digits at the end of the number will then be randomly selected using a computer algorithm, and that then is how you do random digit dialing. For the Peterborough trip, you are not going to do that. So for the Peterborough trip, you'll be lucky if you find membership lists, but it depends also on what you're doing. A phone book, especially the yellow pages if you're interested in businesses. So as an economic geographer, I've used phone books lots of times before. And then trade directories. So again, as an economic geographer, I've used those as well. And so a trade directory, or sometimes a professional directory, or an industry directory, that kind of come in different terms, is a list and the contact information either for people that work in a particular industry or profession, or if it's not people, it's at the very least, the names of the companies and contact information on those companies that, are in, and trade directories tend to be specialized. So I used to do work on the Canadian book trade. So I would get trade directories that just included businesses and individuals that worked somewhere in the Canadian book trade. So either, they were literary agents, or they were book publishing houses, or editors, or they were copy editors, as opposed to like sort of editors that select manuscripts. They then would also then have printers and binders. So because you print a book and then you bind a book, and warehouses, and also retail outlets, right? So a trade directory can, if you're interested in a particular industry, can kind of stretch from the beginning of where the raw material is gathered. So in this case, for the book trade, the raw material was manuscripts, and then all the way to the end where it reaches the final customer, which could be bookstores, though nowadays it's more likely to be online outlets as opposed to brick and mortar bookstores. Okay, but saying that, you don't actually, if you're going to administer interviews, often random sampling doesn't make any sense. I say that knowing that when we are marking research proposals in about 3 weeks, I will have, or whenever, if I reuse this material, so maybe it's really going to be 4 weeks or from when you're actually listening to this, but in the near future, within the next month or so, I will be reading many research proposals, so a large number, not small research proposals, but a large number of research proposals, and more than one student is going to tell me they're using random sampling to select people for their interviews, and they won't provide either a justification for it, because there are circumstances, not that I can easily think of them, but there are circumstances where random sampling might make sense for interviews. But honestly, if you're going to conduct, if you're going to provide, if you are going to use random sampling, you also then, in your research proposal, need to explain what your sampling frame is. So what I would recommend, especially if you are going to be using interviews, is some kind of non-random sampling. And in those cases, the site and the type of non-random, so the site that you're interested in, so that's the place that contains the people that you want to talk to, or that contains the the population of people that you want to talk to. So maybe they're accountants, or maybe they're chemical geologists, or maybe they're vagrants, or maybe they're dog owners. Doesn't matter, but those people will tend to be found in particular places. So that's your site. And then type is going to refer to the type of non-random sampling. So is it going to be snowball sampling? Is it going to be I believe Spickard refers to it as accidental sampling, which is basically whatever warm body you can find is the one that you'll approach. It might be that you actually, for non-random sampling, you might still want to identify your sampling frame. If you were interested in, for whatever reason, speaking to chemical engineers or chemical geologists, maybe you found a list of them that are in, because remember, for your proposal, you're writing it, to do research in Peterborough. So it's a plan to do research in Peterborough, but it is not a plan that you actually need to use next year. You can change your mind, but it still could be that you find a list of, chemical geologists or accountants or, hotel managers or whatever, and you can still have a sampling frame with non-random sampling. And you could just say, I'm basically just going to call through the list, and I'll be using convenience sampling. So, I have this sampling frame, but I'm going to use convenience sampling. And basically, the first 10 people that will talk to me, that's who I'm going to interview. So that's totally fine. You just need to be clear about it in your proposal. And as if I didn't already sound like somebody's dad, let me say this again. Interviews often use non-random samples. If you're going to use a random sample with an interview, I'm going to look for a justification, and often I will judge those harder than I will people that just say I'm going to use a non-random sample and aren't, all that clear about it. Because, and why that is that interviews usually use non-random samples. And if you're going to go against that convention, you need to explain why that is. So if you're looking for the easy way out on your proposal, so if you're looking for something that is more conventional, then pick a kind of non-random sampling for that and explain that. So and why you're using it. But it's an easier sell to use non-random sampling, so it's easier to justify in that case. Let's turn now to the nitty-gritty of writing interview questions. So to write good interview questions, Spickard comes up, I think it's 5. Maybe some of these are mine. So anyway, here are 5 things to bear in mind as you're writing good research, to write good interview questions. So you want to ask clear questions. We've talked about this already with regards to surveys. So that similar kind of issues can arise in interviews as in surveys with regard to how clear the question is. You want to ask, unlike in surveys, surveys usually have closed-ended questions where people have to pick from a list of options. For interviews, they're about open-ended questions. You want people to, as it were, spill their guts about whatever it is you're interested in. Maybe not spill their guts, certainly not in a literal sense, but in a metaphorical sense, you want them to be open because they're going to provide, hopefully, a lot of nuance that you hadn't considered when you originally wrote your research proposal. And so part of what's fun about interviews is that you'll often have kind of preconceived notions of what you think you might find. And actually, as you're interviewing people, you are learning like, oh, wow, I hadn't even thought of that. That's one of the best things about research, is when you are surprised by the findings. Okay, another good practice for writing interview questions is to ask for examples. We'll have an example of that in a moment. You also want to make sure that the questions that you ask in your interview guide, that they flow logically, so that your first question, it makes sense that it comes before the second question, and so on. And again, much of the advice for survey questions also applies to interview questions. So let us turn to exploring these points in a little more detail with some examples. The first point is that you want to ask clear questions. So here's an example of a question that might make sense to me if I've been drowning in literature on job searches in industrial districts and, locational, I guess, how being located somewhere shapes the kinds of jobs you get. So this question, how did the density of opportunities in your new location help you find a job? Most people reading that are going to be like, what in the hell do you mean by that? You do not want your interviewer to have that kind of response. So you want your interviewer to answer your question. And you want them to answer the question that you are asking, not the question that they think you are asking. So the more complicated the question is, the harder it is for the interview subject, that is the person you're interviewing, to actually know what you want to know. So that's bad. It's very jargony, right? However, how did you search for a job when you moved to Niagara is much more clear. So this first question actually, in my mind, reads a bit more like a theoretical question. We do not want to ask these kinds of theoretical questions or questions that emerge kind of from our lit review. We don't want to ask those directly of our research subjects. We want to ask them, questions that are appropriate for an interview. So how did you search for a job when you moved to Niagara might have actually been what I really meant by this, right? And it's specific. It says, how did you search for a job when you moved to Niagara? So it's sort of when you moved implies a particular time, and it's specifying the location. And, how did you search for a job? So not necessarily how did you land a job or, how did you get your job? It's more about the search, and searches often involve dead ends, right? So you apply for 5 jobs and you get one of them. So this question is about the search for a job. And it's not specifying what kind of job. It's just the kinds of jobs you were looking for when you moved to Niagara. And so this is a question that most readers or most people that you interview that speak English as a first language, and even as they used to say ESL as English as a second language, but actually a lot of times when people speak English as a second language, they actually speak a lot of other languages too. So the more common term nowadays is ESL, is English as a subsequent language, right? So you want to think about asking questions that even somebody who might not be a native English speaker, but who still has a good grasp of English, can answer. So that is a better question. So the bigger point here is, first of all, we want to avoid jargon. So density of opportunities, that is a convoluted way of saying, I guess the characteristics of the job market. So was it a good job market? Was it easy to find a job, or was it hard to find a job? Because if there are lots of opportunities, it tends to be easier to find a job, and if there are few opportunities, it tends to be harder to find a job. So that's an example of jargon. You want to avoid that, and you want to avoid the passive voice. Though this doesn't actually use the passive voice, so it's just long and wordy and jargony. You also want to ask open-ended questions. So it's an interview. The only closed-ended question you should be asking on an interview guide is at the very beginning when you're seeking the interview subjects' informed consent. So you're telling them what the research is about and why are you going to ask them these questions, and establishing that they have the right to decline to answer any or all questions. And so you ask them if they understand and if they consent to being interviewed. If they say yes, you continue with your interview. If they say no, then you do not have an interview. You thank them for their time and you go on to do whatever else you have to do that day. Usually, if you've made appointments with people, they'll say yes. You also will want to seek consent. So I guess the other closed-ended question might be asking them, do I have your consent to record this interview? And hopefully they say yes. But if they don't say yes, you need to be able to take notes. And even if they do say yes, you probably still want to take notes. Okay, so ask open-ended questions. So here's a bad one. Did you easily find a new job when you moved to Niagara? So on the surface, it's actually pretty clear. But it's bad because it's not, from my perspective as the researcher, it's not actually asking what I want to know. Oh, actually, sorry, take that back. The reason it's bad is this is something I want to know. But if I ask it this way, did you easily find a new job when you moved to Niagara? The usual response will be yes, no, I don't know. Let me think about that. And the best you're going to get is, they'll say, I don't know. And then they'll tell you a story where they kind of, ramble through, which is what I would do. But I have ADD and I can talk the paint off a wall. So a lot of people, when you interview them, may not feel very comfortable with you. And if you don't ask them open-ended questions, they may decide, they don't want to share very much. Whereas if you ask open-ended questions, it invites them into a conversation. So with the second question here, the second version, how easy was it to find a new job once you moved to Niagara? So, they still might say it was really easy or it was really hard, but then you can follow up with something that's called a prompt. And a good prompt here is if they said, oh, it was really hard, or it was really easy, or oh, it wasn't that bad. And a prompt might be, oh, could you say a bit more about that? So, in relation to what would you, compared to your other experiences, is that why you would say it was more easy or, more difficult? But you want your questions to be open-ended, and you also want to think of prompts that might help move them along to better answer the question and provide some details for their response. So the point here is that yes/no questions will halt an interview. So, and that you only want to ask those when you're asking for consent to conduct the interview and then consent to record the interview. You also will find it easier to get detailed responses by asking for examples. So here's the bad example. When you first moved to Niagara, what was your usual way of searching for jobs? It's not bad, but a better version, so maybe it's more meh, so it's kind of in this gray area. So a better version would be, what is an example of the most effective way you found jobs in Niagara? Or you might get away with even what is or what was the most effective way you found jobs in Niagara. But by underscoring that you want an example, then they're more likely, you've kind of prompted them to provide a specific example. Or you could say, could you provide 2 examples of, the most effective way? But if it's the most effective, it's probably just one way. So a variation of this might be, first you ask, what is an example of the most effective way you found jobs in Niagara? And then this next question might be, what is an example of the least effective way you found jobs in Niagara? Or, or you might just rephrase that as what didn't work. So when you were looking for jobs in Niagara, do you have examples of what did not work in the case, in Niagara? Or when you were looking for jobs in Niagara, what are some examples of things that you tried that did not work or that were, largely unsuccessful? So this second one is generally better, at least for the purposes that I have in mind. And the point about asking for examples is that you want people to be as concrete as possible. And the easiest way to get people to be concrete in their responses is to ask them about their lived experiences. Generally, you don't want to ask people to speculate about things. You want to ask them about, what has been their actual lived experience. And then when they provide, concrete examples, if you've got 10 or 15 of these from, 10 or 15 different people, it might be that, it looks like there's usually, one of three ways are, crop up as most effective. So it can make it easier to not just identify, but then also to illustrate patterns when you are writing up your results. And it actually then can provide, a nice pithy, so a very short but to the point, and evocative example, a quote that you can then use to sort of illustrate these more general patterns. And in qualitative research that's interview-based, you'll often see people draw out quotes to sort of illustrate their points that they're making in their paper. We also want to make sure that our questions flow logically from one to the other. So here's an example of that taking place. So what jobs did you have before you moved to Niagara? So here I'm establishing, what did people do for a living before they moved to Niagara? And then how easy was it to find a new job once you moved to Niagara? So I'm not so concerned about, how easy it was to find a job when they lived somewhere else. I'm really interested in Niagara, in their experience in Niagara. Because it could be that strategies that they had, in these other places don't work in Niagara, or maybe they work better in Niagara, right? So, and this could even be paired with another question between there, which asked them, for the last job you had before you were in Niagara, how easy was it to find? And it might even be like, how did you find that job? So with these two questions in mind, is questions that have already been asked and which have prompted your interview subject to start thinking about jobs that they've had, and especially not just jobs that they've had, but then also a kind of a timeline. So there were jobs before Niagara and since Niagara. So with question 3, we ask, when you first moved to Niagara, what was your usual way of searching for jobs? And so this usual way might have been what they used to do to find jobs when they lived somewhere else. And it might then, when you ask them this question, they're probably also going to start talking about how that was actually pretty effective or not, right? So it's kind of designed to get them to think about, so they first moved here, they needed a job. So how did they go about looking for it? What was your usual way of searching for jobs? And their usual way when they first moved there is probably influenced by their experiences before they were in Niagara. So there's 3 questions. And then we have actually 2 more that kind of flow with this. So in this question, where did you look for these jobs? And actually, you might even say, so once you moved to Niagara, where did you look for these jobs? And so this question can be taken to mean a couple of different things. So sometimes when you say, where did you look for those jobs? sometimes people take that to mean, oh, well, I looked in the want ads in the newspapers. Well, but not that I don't think people do that very much anymore. When I was a teenager, that's where you would look sometimes. But it would be more about kind of, what is the medium that tells you about these jobs? So where did you look for these jobs? Was it monster.com or some other internet site? Was it, a government agency that has a job bank? And what I'm actually interested in what I'm interested in finding out with this question is actually where was their job search? So, they're looking for a job, but is it for positions that are only in Niagara? So it's like, where is the work actually going to take place? And because I couldn't think of an easy way to say that, I then added this example, or this for instance, to help guide the interview subject, to help them think about the location of where they wanted to find a job, right? And not so much, I looked, I went to the unemployment agency, or, I looked in the newspaper. Instead, I wanted them to think about, okay, I live in Niagara. Where do I want to look for jobs? Do I only want to look in Niagara? Do I want to look in Hamilton? Do I want to look further through the GTA? So the GTA, for people that are new to Ontario, is the Greater Toronto area. Did I look in New York? So remember, upstate New York is across the border, and it's sometimes possible to get work permits to work over there. It also depends on your citizenship status, and also the kinds of occupations you have. So, healthcare workers can often through I can't remember the name of it anymore, but there's a NAFTA visa for specialized workers that allows Canadians to work in the United States. So if your interview subject were an occupational therapist, and that's a kind of medical profession, it might be that they could find work across the border in Buffalo or the other Niagara Falls, or somewhere Allegheny, or I don't know, maybe even down in Pennsylvania, right? So because by commuting, it's probably less than an hour away once you get into Buffalo. But it also depends on your commute, or your desired commute. Anyway, the point here is to ask a question that gets people to tell me, where was their job search, in the sense of where did they hope to find a position? Was it close to home, or was it going to involve a commute of some sort? The fifth question is, what is an example of the most effective way you found jobs while living in Niagara? Again, we probably could get away with, what is the most effective way you found jobs while living in Niagara? But by adding this, as an example, you're really asking them to provide one example, because it's singular, of what they think was the most effective way. And so in this case, they might say, oh, well, actually, I, went to a coffee shop and just happened to be hanging out there looking at, monster.com or whatever people look at nowadays. And, this cute person, it depends on, it's your fantasy, so set it up however you want. This cute person looked over my shoulder and said, like, oh, are you looking for a job? And then while flirting with me, they then also, told me about a particular position, and that's how I found the job. So only if all jobs could be found so easily, that would be pretty awesome. So I'll not get to my admonitions yet. So when we are laying things out, when we lay out our interview questions, we want to lay them out in such a way that it helps create a conversation between you and your interview subject. And so, one question sort of prompts them to start thinking about other things that you're then going to ask them about. So that's kind of the point of having flow. So admonitions. So actually I have more than 3 admonitions. So admonitions, you can imagine, I like this word because it's sort of like advice that may or may not actually be wanted, and it tends to be provided by a grumpy person. I guess I fit that bill sometimes. So a thing to remember is that when you're interviewing people, these are reports. So these can be reports of acts, behaviors, and events. So it's not that you've actually observed the acts, behaviors, and events. So, people's memory is fallible. So people, memory, there's lots of research that suggests that, memory is very problematic. And so it can be that people honestly misremember what happened. It can be that people honestly think that one thing happened when really something else happened. So you want to keep that in mind. But also, people have a tendency to take credit for successes, even if they didn't actually do anything to earn those successes, or to cause that success to happen. If you're in the right place at the right time and you've been doing things, you might doing things to try to find a job. It might be that those things that you were doing helped you find a job, or it might just be that they just needed the first person to walk through the door and you were that person, right? So people will often take credit for success, and they'll often blame others for failure. You see this a lot with politicians, or upper management also. So bear that in mind, right? So just because somebody is telling you something doesn't mean it actually happened. That's what they're telling you. They may be, they may not honestly remember. They may have a kind of a bias in the sense that, people subconsciously tend to take credit for success and tend to subconsciously blame external factors for their failure. They may just be psychopaths who are really liars, right? Also, they might think you're cute, and they might then decide just to tell you what they think you want to hear so they can get your phone number. That occasionally happens. So you want to keep all of these things in mind, right? So the person that you're speaking to is telling you things that may or may not be true, and that they may or may not, know are true. If you're interested, the second admonition is if you're interested in truth with a capital T, so trying to understand what really actually happened, you might want to triangulate your interviews with other data sources. So, if somebody says, for instance, oh, I was, the best small business owner in 2014 for Thorold, you probably can look that up just to make sure that was really the case, right? So likewise, and maybe they're wrong. Maybe it was actually 2013 or 2015, or maybe actually it was like from 2007 to 2014, but they only remembered 2013, or maybe they're lying, right? So they could be telling you the truth. They could be misremembering. They could be lying. If you're interested, finding what really happened to the degree that that's possible, if you're really interested in that, then you will want to identify other data sources that can help corroborate the claims that your interview subjects are making. And the third thing, I've already talked about this a bit, is unless you want speculation, you need to ask people about their actual experiences. This is why you want them to provide you examples. This is why you want to ask them examples. Can you provide an example of, the worst time your dog got loose, or whatever it is? And those will tend to be more vivid, more detailed, and probably more likely to be the truth. all other things being equal. I think this might be the last slide. Oh, no, it is not. All right, this is the last slide. So this, I love flowcharts. This is a flowchart from your textbook, Spickard. So chapter 9, figure 9.6, interview rule of thumb flowchart for non-random samples. So only for non-random samples. So this answers the question of how many interviews are enough. So he says set a minimum number of people to interview, usually 25 to 30. So that's the minimum number. Honestly, if you're going to go to Peterborough, I'd be surprised if you could, in 3 days, get more than like 15 interviews. And that's with you lining the interviews up before you go. So if you show up and you want to interview people right then and there, you are going to have a very small response rate if you get any respondents. So as much as possible, you want to try to set up your interviews before you go to Peterborough. So you have them scheduled and then you just have to show up. Then you want to set a maximum number of people to interview. So he recommends twice the minimum. So if you were, in the case of Peterborough, wanting to get, 10 people as a minimum, then I would set 20 as a maximum. So, and then his recommendation is you conduct the minimum number of interviews and then ask yourself, have you learned anything new in the last 5 interviews? Often with 10 interviews, you're still going to be learning new stuff. And so in Peterborough, you're going to be stuck in a situation where you probably don't actually have time to reach a point, or maybe you do, but probably not, to reach a point in which you have heard essentially the same thing in the last 5 interviews. Also, this is easier to figure out, to identify if you're doing your interviews over a couple of weeks instead of like over 3 days, because at least you have time to think about them and process them. So if yes, so have you learned anything new in the last 5 interviews? Yes, then he says so if you have learned something new, ask yourself, have you reached your maximum number of interviews? If yes, then regroup, rethink, change your research questions so that the interviews you have answer it, or so on. In Peterborough, you want to kind of keep that in mind. Or you might also want to say, these are provisional findings. You might call what you do a pilot study. And so in this pilot study, I've learned, among other things, that each interview provided new information, which suggests that perhaps I need a more specific research question next time, if there would be a next time, or that I change my research question. So if you answer no to this question, then conduct 5 more interviews, and then ask yourself, have you learned anything new in the last 5 interviews? And you rinse and repeat. So if then you eventually hit no over here, hopefully, so you haven't learned anything new, you keep hearing the same thing, and then you ask yourself, have you done only the minimum number of interviews? So if you said you were going to do between 10 and 20, have you only done 7? Even though the last 5 you've heard the same thing? Well, tough. That means you should really go out and do some more interviews. So go conduct 5 more, and then ask yourself if you heard anything new. Then if you get no, or you run out of time, then you're done. So if you have done more than your minimum number of interviews and you're not hearing anything new, then Spickard says you're done and you can stop. So in your research proposal, you'll want to identify the minimum and maximum number of interviews if you're going to conduct interviews. Likewise, if you are going to use surveys, you'll probably want to identify the minimum number of surveys you want, and then a maximum number, right? And in a lot of other cases, actually, for soil samples, the example I used earlier about, lead contamination in soil alongside the road, in those cases, you actually might, in those cases, you probably want to, establish a minimum number of transects that you would like to measure along, and a maximum number, because it could be that the road that you set up alongside is rockier than you thought it might be, or there are, I don't know, wild animals that might bite you, and so you have to move somewhere else, or I don't know, like things like that can happen. So you want to think of, what's the minimum number of observations that you want, what's the maximum number. In any case, whether you're actually interviewing people or not, the rules for when to stop are somewhat different for things that aren't interviews. And those rules, then you'll want to refer to your literature review and what other people have done to get a sense of where to, what's the minimum number and maybe where to stop. I think that is all. Thank you very much. And I look forward to talking to you later. And I misspoke. There are actually a couple of more things on this slide. Let me show you. So if you think in terms of like big N and little n, so this has more to do with people that have been trained in inferential statistics, where little n is your sample size and big N is your population size. You might think of this as your N is probably going to be somewhere between 25 and 30. Your maximum is just going to be twice whatever that number is, so twice N. This is just kind of superfluous mathematical wankery, frankly. But the thing that you want, the key in Spickard's flowchart is asking yourself, what's new? Have I heard anything new? If I've heard nothing new, then, I go over here and then I ask myself, do I have enough interviews? And if I have heard something new, then I ask myself, have I reached my maximum number of interviews? And this box down here, a solution to that is, especially in the Peterborough context, is to consider rewriting your research question, or in your final paper, because for Peterborough, not only do you collect your data, so for the Peterborough course, you'll write up a research proposal. Your instructor will look over it and provide feedback. You might have to then, write up some research ethics protocols, and then you will collect your data. And so the research ethic protocols are, if you are dealing with human subjects, and they'll talk more about that in the third year course. Then you'll collect your data, and then you'll analyze your data and you'll write up your results. So it might be that you have interviewed the maximum number of people and you're still hearing new stuff. So at that point, what you might do, and I would consult your instructor in the course, is what you can do is say, okay, here was my original research question. I was still hearing new things even when I reached my maximum number of interviews. So in light of that, in light of that situation, and in light of my original research question, I've narrowed my original research question down to be this other research question that it's related to it, but is that my data seem like they can answer that you've actually asked, right? So that's one of the weird things about qualitative research, is that it's often easier to kind of go back through and realize, like, your initial question, you thought it was good, but it either sucks or you're not finding anything interesting, but oh wow, you found out this new stuff that nobody's talked about. And so then if you were going to write up a paper or even a thesis or a dissertation, you might say, originally I wanted to, find out about X, But actually, what I found out, what I found out about X wasn't particularly interesting because everybody else has already said this. But what I did find out that I haven't seen in a lot of other literature or at all is this other thing, and then talk about that. This, I promise, is now the end of lecture 9.